This is Nalini Haynes, and this is a Dark Magazine podcast. Dark Magazine is setting a new record. We're expecting 500,000 visits to the website. So please come have a look at the website and join the fun. Now today I'm talking to T Frohock, otherwise known as Teresa. Teresa has turned a love of history and dark fantasy into tales of deliciously creepy fiction. A real-life cyborg, Teresa has a cochlear implant, meaning she can turn you on or off with the flick of a switch. Make of that what you will. She currently lives in North Carolina, where she has long been accused of telling stories, which is a southern colloquialism for lying. Her latest novel is Where Oblivion Lives. Welcome, Teresa.
Oh, thank you for having me. Oh, and I can understand you beautifully now.
Excellent. Please tell us a bit about your latest novel, Where Oblivion Lives.
Okay. This is where I always get kind of pulled up because I don't talk about my own books very well. I get much more enthusiastic about other people's stuff. But the book, Where Oblivion Lives, it's a continuation of the 3 novellas that I wrote that's set in the world of Los Nefilim, which are Spanish Nephilim who use music and light and sound waves, actually, in order to conduct their magic. So it was something that's always fascinated me about the way chromathesia, where people can actually see sound. They see color and sound. And so I sort of took that idea and gave it to the Nephilim and totally warped the Solomon story up one side and down the other. And it's a combination of my love of history and religion. And I've just really enjoyed writing it.
That sounds great. This is part of a larger series, as you mentioned. How does it fit in the bigger picture? Do you need to read the previous novels first?
No, I like to write standalones. I really do. I hate cliffhanger novels or novels where you have to keep reading the same books over and over again. And it's one thing that Mark Lawrence did with one of his novels that I really liked is he did in a author's note, he wrote a short, not really a prologue, but just like a short bulleted account of how we got to where we are, so that people who read the book a year ago could kind of pick it up and breeze through it. So I didn't do that with Where Oblivion Lives, because when we talked about writing that novel, we talked about giving it to readers as if it was a brand new world, as if the novellas didn't exist. And we wanted people to be able to just jump right into the story. So that's what we did with Where Oblivion Lives. The second novel that I'm working on now, Carved from Stone and Dream, I have done a brief synopsis of the novellas and of Where Oblivion Lives, so that readers won't feel like they don't know what's going on if they happen to pick that book up as the first in the series, but also so that readers who've read the other books kind of can get a little bit of a memory jog, because I don't know about you, but I read a lot of books, and so it kind of helps to pick up something and be able to go through and go, oh, this is where we left off last time. But the main theme of the story really is them working together to compose something they call the key. And all of the adventures they have in each of the stories leads them to the next movement of that song. And as the stories go on, in Where Oblivion Lives, the 2 children are aged 7 and 8. Diego, who has a son, and Guillermo has a daughter who he wants to see take over Los Nefilim one day. In the second novel, they're 14 and 15. And so as I move them into teenagers, I'm kind of moving all of the older characters back and moving the younger characters in position to take their place. So it's kind of a generational story, but they're very, very tight. Very, if you like thrillers, I think you will like them.
Sounds great. You've written diversity in this novel, including lots of queer representation and a variety of races. Why is representation important to you?
I want to reflect the world that we see and that we live in. I have a wide variety and a very diverse group of friends, and I think they're so wonderful, and they just fill my life. They really do. And they make me see things that I wouldn't normally see if I was isolated just in a small community of people like me. And I believe that as a writer, I have the responsibility to reflect the world as it is, not this little teeny slice of it. So that's one reason why. The other reason why with the queer representation especially, it's kind of funny how that came about. When I first wrote these characters, they were in the novel that didn't sell. And what happened was, it was really about Guillermo, my straight character, in the beginning. And as I was writing it, I realized I'm writing a really cliched story here. I'm writing a story about a guy who's learning to accept his gay friend for who he is. And I thought, and it's really not his story at all. It was really Diego's story from the beginning. And so when I shifted that perspective and I quit trying to make it, I didn't want it to be about teaching somebody to accept Diego. I wanted it to be about Diego accepting himself. And the more I worked on it, the more I realized that it was about him and his relationship with his husband, and how it didn't matter what the rest of the world thought. They see themselves as very normal. That's a bad way to say it, but they see themselves as very accepting of one another, and there's nothing wrong with their lifestyle. Their love is just as important to each other as anyone else's. And I think that's what I wanted to reflect with the novel, especially now with so many people. You know, every time I think we've reached this point of acceptance, it just goes away, and it just bothers me.
I figure that someone's sexuality doesn't affect me. It's not my business if I'm not having sex with them. So
And that's it. That's exactly it. I mean, I don't understand why people get so upset about it, to be honest with you. And I have some friends who are just lovely. And as a matter of fact, it was Rob Dunbar for me when I was writing the first novel. I wanted to ask some questions, and I told Rob, I said, I don't want people to think badly of me because I'm trying to understand this, but at the same time, I need a safe space. And he was so marvelous. He opened up a forum for me in a space that he owned, so he could control who came in and who went out. And it was fabulous. I was able to ask questions, and several people gave me some very honest and heartfelt answers, and it was a very safe space for all of us. And it was just marvelous. I've always been grateful to him for that. And so I used that in order to create Diego's character. And then I thought, why am I making a big deal about any of this? He's a person. He's He's one of my favorite characters that I've ever had the opportunity to write, mainly because he's so ancient, he's so old, but everything is still new to him. He's still learning how to live with other people and learning how to give and not take all the time. And so it's just really a lot of fun to write him. And Mikhail is just the epitome of patience with him. And so it's the kind of relationship I've always wanted to portray in a novel, not of sex, 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 but of what a relationship really is, two people taking care of each other. And so I've just been so happy with the way the novels have worked, and I just really enjoy writing them.
That's fantastic. Where Oblivion Lives is largely set in 1930s Europe. Now, the main character travels to Germany, so he tangles with Nazis. What inspired you to include Nazis in your novel? There are so many Nazi speculative fiction stories at the moment, from SSGB to Iron Sky, and of course your novel. Now, why do you think that is?
Why use the 30s? Well, there's a couple of reasons. My father was he was a historian, and he grew up during World War II. He was a child, and one of his brothers was killed during that conflict. So he developed a really huge fascination about World War II and the history surrounding it. So as I grew up, I listened to him, and I just loved him so dearly. I wanted to be conversant with him on the subject. So I wound up reading a lot about it, and I attacked it from a different angle. He was very interested in the dates and the events and the military battles, and I became a lot more interested in the people and the social circumstances that brought it all together. And so that was one thing. I had just a really big background about it. I wanted to set it more during the Spanish Civil War. In the first book that didn't sell, they were Spanish, so I kept them Spanish. And I thought, well, let's do the Spanish Civil War, since a lot of people had a lot of misconceptions about it. And the Spanish Civil War is really a very complex event, and I found I spend a lot more time talking about the Spanish Civil War sometimes than I do anything else. But those early 30s were just such a fascinating time to live in. There was so much new intellectual thought being bandied about. Groups were starting to stand up for themselves. Feudalism was finally really dying. I mean, you want to say it disappeared in the Middle Ages, but the framework of it remained, and the names just changed. A lot of the problems in Spain were a lot of the problems that caused the American Civil War. You had agriculture in the South, and you had industry in the North, and as people in the North started to gain more upward mobility, they wanted that for themselves. They wanted more equality in the workplace, and that bled south, and things just really erupted right around 1936. And the problem is they had elected a government that was giving them the things they wanted. It was the military that rebelled because they didn't like the fact that the new Republican government, the Second Republic, was not. They were cutting the military. They were knocking down on some of the hierarchies that had been there for so long. So it was just really a fascinating time. Meanwhile, you've got that going on down there. France was going through its own growing pains in the same way. And Germany was still trying to dig out from the First World War. And that was what caused a lot of the frustration there. But I had to do quite a bit of research. I think people just think Nazis just sprang up overnight, and they did. There'd been a lot of unrest after the First World War, and that's what created a lot of the friction and It just created kind of environment that people like Hitler could thrive.
I thought you'd made errors in your novel, and then I researched what you'd included, like the brown jackets being around from about 1920. And so I was really impressed with your historical knowledge, and I learned something.
It was it writing any kind of historical fiction, if it's historical fantasy or even just any kind of historical fiction. 90% of it is getting the details right. I spend so much time on Pinterest looking at clothing from the 30s and that kind of thing. But the information, like with the brown shirts, that was really easy to find the dates in which they first came into existence. It's just, I've got so many books on the subject. It's not funny. I've read a lot to begin with, and I had to find them. I have little sticky notes everywhere. I have to. And Beth Cato, as a matter of fact, she also uses history in her steampunk. And she told me, she said, what she does is she writes notes in the books and then puts the notes like at the front of the book so that anytime she needs them, there they are. And that's why I use the big stickies. So probably a detail no one's interested in, but it keeps me straight because I can usually remember what book I found the information in. And I also still use the internet a lot, but I always back it up with something factual. I think with Carved from Stone and Dream, I'll be putting a very brief bibliography in the back of that one. I'm going to send it and see if I can get it in if it's not too late, because I think a lot of people ask me what I read to find out the information that I find out, and I'm really very finicky about what kind of books I'm going to read. In Where Oblivion Lives, there was the cult that I mentioned several times, and a lot of people were very fascinated about the Nazis being involved with the occult, and they were and they weren't. They were up until it became embarrassing, and then they would drop. And there was a couple of times it became very embarrassing, but it was kind of funny. I had one book and it was very, very dry, very scholarly. I mean, I had a hard time getting through it, and but it was very informative. And that's where I pulled out a lot of Carl's philosophy and how he saw the world and the Armageddon of being the salvation, which I see a lot around here in the area that I live. You can see a lot of the American evangelicals are geared toward that kind of Armageddon cult of when it all ends, everything's going to be okay. And I'm not quite sure that's really how it's going to work out. That's what I usually do, and I usually spend a whole lot more time tracking down details than I do just imagining fictions. I've written third world fantasy, and in some ways it's easier, but I still find myself doing a lot of research for that. I did that with my first novel, World, that I kind of came up with Misery, and that was more religion based than the Los Nefilim series. I wanted to give the Los Nefilim series just this wide open world where I just played loose with the facts and made a lot of things up. But other things come from religious texts that I've managed to get a hold of and have translations of and have some books on too.
Yeah, I love the research, and I love I love books where they actually give you an account of this is what is a fact. I
Yeah.
think the first time I remember that was in Mary Stewart's Crystal Cave series, and she listed, these are the legends, and I think she might have even listed her sources. I was in high school when I read them. So, that was really, really made an impression. I love it when authors do that.
Well, one of the first historical books that I read, and I know she wasn't a very good person, but Marion Zimmer Bradley's Mist of Avalon was the very first novel that I wrote that could actually be called historical fantasy. And I mean, I loved it. And I read Jean M. Orrell's Clan of the Cave Bear series. I mean, all of that was just, it was so rich in detail, and the characters were so alive. I mean, it was just wonderful. Hello, Dimey. My dog is here. My dog, I don't know if you can see her or not, but see, this is my dog.
I can see the nose.
Dimey, come here. You're on camera. Funny. Yeah, but those were the kind of books that I really I just ate them up. I couldn't get enough of them. Was, Clan of the Cave Bear, especially. As a matter of fact, The Mist of Avalon, I think, was the only book by Marion Zimmer Bradley that I ever really, really enjoyed. The rest of them were okay, but I mean, it's just, to me, it was just that fabulous amount of research they put into it, but they were able to make it live. And I don't know, I feel like the Los Nefilim books are more like the serials from the 40s. They're not as rich to me in detail as Jean M. Orrell's books, but at the same time, I wanted them to have, well, yeah. Bricks, but I mean, I never lost interest in them, and part of it too was because I'm deaf, and when I was a teenager, TV was so hard for me. All of that was so hard for me, but reading was just so easy. So, but what I wanted to do with the Los Nefilim books was, my dad always had this The Shadow. I don't know if you remember it or not. They were serials from the 40s. And my dad would listen to them on the radio, and he would go, "The Shadow knows." And he had this beautiful baritone voice and would just roll it out. And it was great. And they were like spy novels. And Lamont Cranston was the hero, and he would go around and solve mysteries, and at the same time there was kind of a supernatural edge to it. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if Lamont Cranston was like bisexual, and he just went in there and did what he wanted to do? And I've got that with Diego, and I mean, he's just really great. He's a smooth operator. I like him for that. And he doesn't seem that way so much in Where Oblivion Lives, but in Car from Stone and Dream, you get to see him interact with Guillermo. And my editor told me, he said, they're almost like a buddy cop series, the way they play off of each other, which was a lot of fun. And I also want the third one I'm also working on, and it's really dark, but at the same time, I think this third one is going to be more of Diego and Mikel working together. I thought it was kind of fun to let the reader see him as he functions alone, and then also see him as he functions with Guillermo. And then in this last one, I wanted them to see him and Mikel together and how they work together. So the hardest part is picking the year and making the history work, or making the story work with the history. I can't change the history, but I can definitely make the story work within the history. And so that's why the last one was in 1932. I had wanted to set it a little later, like 1935, but I realized that the history wouldn't work as well for what I needed Diego to do. So it can kind of hold me back in terms of what I want to do with the story and how I have to move them around the country. Moving them through France is going to be interesting. I've got about 8 books on the time period because the Nazis controlled France at that point. And they like to say that half of France was free, but it wasn't. Vichy France was just as horrible as Paris in that area as well. So it was a tough time to live in. But the number of women spies and the there were so many. That's why in the third one I want to give Isabel a moment to shine, because she's such a great character, and the older she gets, she's just this great combination of the personality of her mom and her dad. And her dad, it just believes that, he can always do whatever he needs to do, and she does too. But she and Violetta is her best friend, and they're going to really get some time in the third book, because I want to kind of bring out how a lot of the women were able to do things that men weren't able to do. They were able to move through the Nazi territories with a lot more ease, because sometimes prejudice can work for you. And the Nazis didn't expect women to be involved that much. They also would let women slide with things. And so they're going to use that and maneuver through the territory. And they're both killers. I guess that's the other thing, is neither one of them are nice girls. I don't want them to be nice girls. I want them to be the products of their upbringing and the products of their training, and they're both trained to kill. So they're going to be interesting. I think Isabel's thing is that she needs to learn to temper her need to move forward a bit, but she knows what she wants, and she's, by God, gonna get it. I love her for that. She's a great character.
She is a kick-ass chick when she's yay high, and it'll be interesting to see her grow up.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, because even at 8, that was one reason why I wanted that scene. Some people have wondered why I put that little dinner scene in Where Oblivion Lives, but I really wanted you to see the kids as they're young, because that shapes how they'll grow up. And Isabel especially, even at 8, she's going to challenge authority and say she's very assertive. And I like that. She reminds me in some ways of my daughter. My daughter was very assertive like that. Still is, as a matter of fact. And it's a great quality to have. Whereas Raphael is more laid back and kind of standoffish when he's younger, but he gets a few moments of his own in Carved from Stone and Dream. It's really Mikhail and Raphael's story more than anybody else's, the second novel.
Now, you identify as deaf because you're hard of hearing with a cochlear implant. What listeners can't see is that I'm asking Teresa questions via text, which she's reading while I'm talking. Can you please share how that impacts on your work and why you chose not to write a deaf character in Where Oblivion Lives?
Okay, well, Where Oblivion Lives, it would be hard for Nefilim to be deaf, mainly because they work their magic through music, so it requires them to be able to hear pitches. I've tried to write deaf characters in the past, and I don't know, I never found a character that really spoke to me in a way that I could convey a story at this point. That doesn't mean it's not going to happen. Being deaf, does mean that in my books I incorporate a lot of body language. I don't know if people notice it, but I do mention the way people move and the way people react. And Diego is really hypersensitive to it. Part of that is because he's abused. He was abused as a child. And that makes children very hypersensitive to other people's body language. But it's something that I've learned as a deaf person, especially before the cochlear implant. I was able to usually tell how a conversation was going from across the room without actually hearing what was being said, just by watching how the people reacted to one another. When someone's trying to comfort another person, they'll usually reach out and touch, either touch their arm or touch their wrist, or, lean in. Sometimes it's very small, sometimes it's very, very overt. But it was just something I learned to watch for. Reading lips and hearing in general, I don't think people realize how easy it makes their lives to be able to hear. I really don't. Because having grown up being able to hear and then losing my hearing, it wasn't so much about noise around me. It was about that ability to communicate. I could speak, I could talk, but I couldn't understand what people were trying to say to me. And a lot of people will just get frustrated and they'll just say, oh, never mind. And that would shut me out even more. So you tend, or at least I did anyway, I tended to isolate when I couldn't hear. I stopped going to conventions. I stopped really going out in the community and doing anything. It was very isolating, and it can lead to a lot of depression too. So I don't know. I haven't in Los Nefilim especially, having a deaf character would be kind of difficult to convey, since I look more at the community of the Nephilim rather than at the mortals that they live around. So it's not something that I think I would put in these books, but there's still other characters and there's still so many other stories to tell. And the problem with using a deaf character, though, is there needs to be some way to move them through the world with an ability to communicate. Because I did try writing a mute character in a novella that's out of print now. And that was kind of hard to write, too, because you don't realize how much you depend on your voice and how much you depend on your ability to speak until you start trying to you get away from a character and then have him move to a world that's normal. There's that word again. But where everyone else can do things that you can't. And it's frustrating. So writing a deaf character for me would kind of resurrect a lot of that frustration. And for me, I know it's selfish, but the reason I write is to escape. And I write for the same reason I read. I want to get away from the things that frustrate me, and kind of have like a John Wick kind of world where you can get into as many fights as you want to, and you still just, jump up like a and just keep going and going and going, and it's great. But it's fun, and that's what I like to write. I think sometimes when I get in one of my darker moods, I do have some stories that I've written when I was in some of my depression or some of my darker moods, and I don't enjoy them as much. I don't enjoy rereading them, and I can't imagine how anybody would really want to read them. So I don't know. I like to entertain more than anything else. But even though I'm entertaining, I want to stay true to life, if that makes sense. up to a point.
Okay, stories with disabled characters usually treat disability as a narrative prosthesis. Now, a few examples of narrative prosthesis include disability as a plot point, like in Joe Hill's The Fireman. A disabled person is used to humanise or teach non-disabled characters, like in Rain Man. Disability as symbolic for a character flaw, or disability as inspiration porn. Did these types of tropes influence your decision to veer away from disability issues?
Yes, definitely. And that was the other reason. As a matter of fact, you phrased it very beautifully there. That's the other reason why I did not want the story to be about Guillermo accepting Diego as queer, because it was that same type of thing. You have a symbolic character who's there, and they're there to really essentially tell people what they already know. Okay, seriously. And I like the idea of a narrative prosthesis, because that's exactly what a lot of it is. So that was why, if I write a disabled character, I'm doing it from that disabled character's point of view. And I keep going back to normal, and I wish my brain were working better. I don't know if it's the heat or what that's killing me, but it's not about being normal as what we consider normal. It's about being human and being different and being diverse. That's the important thing. So, yeah. So that's why I kind of avoid the disabled characters. I want them to have their own story and to have their own motivations, the same way I've done with my queer characters. Mm-hmm. They need to be whole people, and it's their story.
Mm.
And not agency. Exactly. Thank you. Yes, and if they don't have agency, or I can't give them agency, I'm not going to hang them out there as window dressing, because that's not fair to the people who are disabled either. Seriously, it's not. I wouldn't want people doing it to me. I remember, I'm so old, I remember Lassie, okay? Old Lassie, where they dropped Timmy down the well about once a week or so. And there was a hearing character who played a deaf girl who read lips. And that was her thing, is she could read lips. And she was kind of there as that prosthesis. She was there to show you that deaf people could function. And I think they overshot their wad with that kid, because she could hear, she wasn't really acting like a deaf person. And as someone who spent several years reading lips, let me tell you something. You're not going to get the whole conversation as clearly as she did. Okay? When I read lips, if I'm not wearing my implant, my processor, I always wear my implant. If I'm not wearing my processor, then I'm relying mainly on lip reading, because I do have some residual hearing in my left ear. Okay, so I rely on lip reading. My thing is I'm getting like 4 words out of 20, and I'm making the rest up in my brain. And most of the time I'm wrong, okay, about what someone's saying to me, because you can miss a lot. And that was what I would see with her, is she was lip reading and just understanding the conversation perfectly. It was like watching the difference in actresses between A Quiet Place. I don't know if you watch much horror or if you've seen it, but the young actress in A Quiet Place was actually deaf. As a matter of fact, we went to see the movie, and my daughter was punching me when we first saw her cochlear implant. Okay? The other movie that I saw recently was The Silence, which is based on a similar premise. and it had to do with a actress who was not deaf, and it was obvious to a deaf person that she was not deaf. It was also obvious to a deaf person that the people who produced the movie had no idea what it was like to be a deaf person. And I wrote blog posts about both of them. A Quiet Place was really wonderful because they really took that young actress's suggestions and they listened to her, and that's what makes up the difference in representation. When you have someone who's actually disabled, they can tell you how these circumstances would actually affect them, and that's very important. And it does. It comes across in both books and in film. If you're not disabled, or you don't have you've not spoken with someone who's disabled, yeah, you can really blow it, and then drop Timmy down the well once a week.
Can I share my absolute favorite depiction of blindness or vision impairment? It's from the last season of Doctor Who, where you have the character, the blind girl, and I'm watching this episode, and I mean, I have my 55-inch TV and I'm sitting about a metre from it, so I can pick up some of it, and I'm looking at it and thinking, gee, this is an unusual depiction of blindness. It's unusually good. And then my husband said, I think the actress is actually blind. I'm like, oh, and I went and I Googled it, and it's like, I have so much love for Doctor Who's new showrunner, and already before watching that episode, but I tell you what, I just want to hug him. He deserves all the awards. Hugo Award voters, vote for that showrunner. Vote for that episode of Doctor Who. It was just amazing, right down to in one scene. One of the Doctor's companions, I forget his name, he says to the blind girl to put her hand on his arm so he can lead her. It's like, and there's a shot of her doing exactly that. He doesn't grab her. He doesn't shove her around. It's like, I mean, the only thing I'd change is perhaps having her ask him to lead her because, but that was perfect. It was amazing.
It is. It really is. And I'll be honest with you. I think, I know people come down on Twitter for a lot of things, but I have learned so much on Twitter. I really have. How people who are disabled, who are not disabled like me, for what you were talking about, vision impairments. We had a student at the library where I work who is blind and partially deaf. And because of listening or reading, however you want to say it, I was able to understand that I could speak to her and say, I'm on your left side, and here it says, is it okay if I take your arm, instead of just reaching out and touching her? I mean, it just gave me a perspective of how to deal with these events in real life. And I think a lot of it is respecting the disabled person. I'm like most disabled people. I'm very independent, and I want to depend on myself. But I do appreciate help when people offer to help. And I think it really is if I'm going to represent someone, I want to represent them in such a way that they can have the same kind of reaction that I had at the Quiet Place and that you had, with that episode of Doctor Who. It just makes such a huge difference. And it also is teachable. Okay. I don't use disabled people or queer people in order to showcase a straight person or an able-bodied person's representation. But at the same time, if I've got someone in a book who is disabled or who is queer, I want them to have the same respect that I would want for me. And I think that's important. That's what I have to put in my stories. I don't always want to represent the negative aspects of the world. There's a lot of positive in the world, too. And because my stories are sometimes dark, that's why I spend a lot of time also on the lighter aspects, on the family, on those little moments between Diego and Mikkel that solidifies their love for each other, because I think those small moments are what sustain us through the tragedies and through the big horrible things that happen throughout the books. And I want that to be represented as well. There's so much to being human. Somebody asked me one time, why didn't I talk more about being deaf? And I said, because I don't want to be known as a deaf author. I said, that's a little part of me. And it is with any disabled. Your disability is only a part of you. It's not all of you. And it's not all of me. You know, I'm a wife, I'm a mother, I work a full-time job, I'm a writer, I'm all these things. And all of these things about me are just as important as my inability to hear, you know. So that's why I spend so much time working on that.
Yeah, I think it's really important. So, can you tell us what will be the highlights of your life over the next year?
I'm going to try to stay out of jail. I always think that's really a positive aspect for me. Everybody laughs. Everybody sees me online. I've got some serious anger management issues, and the political situation in the U.S. right now just has not been helping me at all. But the highlight of my year next year, let's talk about books, because that's what everybody's here for. The highlight of my year next year is when Carved from Stone and Dream comes out. I'm really, I'll be honest with you, this was a hard book to write, because what happened was last summer when I was really trying to work on it, I had a torn meniscus in my knee. And so I had to have surgery. And then my poor husband was in the hospital for 9 days with a heart issue. And then we had 2 hurricanes hit back to back. So I essentially sat and wrote this novel in about 2 months, which was a world record for me. And I just felt like it was horrible. It was so horrible to me. And now that I'm going through the edits, it really looks good. So I'm excited about it again. I have a really great editor. The crew at Harper Voyager, David Pomerico and the whole crew there, they are so wonderful and so supportive of this series. And David, especially, his editorial input has just really made a huge difference in it for me. And he just knows the characters and just really loves them. And considering how many books he reads a year, I just think that's amazing. So I'm excited for that. I am looking at going at one major con next year. I would like to try that. And other than that, it's just some days it just feels like keeping my head above water, but that's it. And finish up the 3rd book and get it turned in and work on that, because we'll be working on copy edits on that throughout next year too. And then after that, I don't know. We'll just kind of have to wait and see.
Sounds good. Last question. Who would win, Wonder Woman or Black Widow?
Wonder Woman. Oh, I love Wonder Woman. Wait. Wonder Woman forever. I've never collected these things before, but when Wonder Woman came out, I had to have her. I had to have all of them. You know why? You know, I grew up with Wonder Woman, and she was just the perfect feminist when I was growing up. We didn't have a lot of female superheroes that weren't sexy smexy all over the place. And Wonder Woman was never like that. Wonder Woman, she was a career woman. She was a superhero. She was a goddess. She was all the things that I really needed to see growing up in a very small town in the South. So I've always loved Wonder Woman. And also because Wonder Woman was the first movie I saw when I was, after I got my implant. And I sat there, and I used to go to movies all the time, and I stopped when I couldn't hear. And so my daughter went with me, and she couldn't believe it. She was handing me tissues because I was crying through the whole movie. And it was just so great. And Gal Gadot, she is the perfect Wonder Woman. She really is. So sorry, Black Widow. I'm a Wonder Woman girl.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you for talking to Dark Matter, and all the best for the coming year.